Today, it's a topic that I'm sure all of you are very interested in, have been waiting a while to hear from us about. Our chairs for today's forum is Heather Tierney, who is the Senior Publishing Ethics Manager at the American Chemical Society and is currently a member of COPE Council. She will be joined by her colleague, Elizabeth Moylan, who is the Senior Manager of Research Integrity, Strategy, and Policy at Wiley. She is also a former COPE Council member. And so I want to welcome them both and open up the forum.
As Dan said, this has been a long discussed topic where COPE has had the COPE retraction guidelines, which mention expressions of concern, but has not yet had its own document specifically about expressions of concern. This has been discussed previously at other forums and on the COPE website, but we really wanted to have a guidance document available for you. I'm sad to say it is not available on the website yet. We have had spectacular discussions amongst the COPE Council, and based on that continuing discussion, unfortunately, the guidance is not up yet, but it is coming soon. And Elizabeth and I will hopefully go through a preview for you today of what that guidance will look like once it's up in a little bit. To preview what we will be opening up the floor at the end to talk about the questions posed as part of the forum. What has been your experience when issuing an expression of concern? Are there particular challenges or pain points you've experienced? And what types of guidance will be useful going forward? So if you want to start thinking about those and posting your feedback, we will get into our preview of the document.
Thanks, Heather. So Heather and I are going to walk through the kind of preview of the document with the relevant sections that we've covered, starting with the definition of expressions of concern, which is in line with NISO CREC guidance, which was published in June this year. So an expression of concern is a notice to alert readers to significant and credible concerns that have been raised about the reliability of a publication but do not meet the criteria for retraction as outlined in the COPE retraction guidelines. Or there could be conclusive evidence that's not available or cannot be obtained for a significant period of time. And what we're seeing is expressions of concern being used as an interim notice and followed up with either a correction or retraction when more information becomes available, or it might be a final outcome for an article that will not be updated further. So that's as far as you can take the outcome. Just a quick note on terminology here. By interim, in line with NISO CREC, we mean an update whilst waiting for more information to become available. We don't mean that that's a temporary notice. An interim notice is also a permanent notice. I think, Heather, you've got some nice examples of those sorts of scenarios.
So looking at the summary that was proposed for this document, expanding on the definition that Elizabeth just shared, editors should consider issuing an expression of concern to alert readers to potential concerns. When there are significant and credible concerns, and it is unclear whether there are parts of the work that are potentially unreliable, or an institutional or other investigation is ongoing that may result in corrections, where authors have been asked to provide additional information and that information is not immediately available, or there's a breach of journal or publisher policy that cannot be resolved, and a resolution is not expected for a significant period of time on the order of months, for example.
So what form should an expression of concern take? Again, it's great that the NISO CREC guidance on communication of retractions, removals and expressions of concern is available. So that's the best way to create, display and disseminate metadata associated with expressions of concern. So we point to that in the guidance. An expression of concern should be discoverable. There should be clear links between the notice and the article to identify the article, And it's also helpful in accordance with NISO CREC that one notice can link to several articles, and that might be helpful in paper mill scenarios. The expression of concern should be accessible, freely available, state the reasons for concern, and be objective, factual, and avoid inflammatory language.
So we're going to go through a number of what are sections in the guidance document currently that raise questions that we've attempted to address. So the first of which is who should issue an expression of concern? And while we do recognize that in most instances, this would be the editor of the journal that's issuing a concern to their readers, there are also instances where publishers may wish to issue expressions of concern. We've discussed that in the document that this is acceptable to come from either the publisher or editor, as long as it's made clear within the expression of concern itself who is issuing that expression of concern.
So how quickly should an expression of concern be issued? As with retractions, timeliness is important when considering an expression of concern, but it's important to give due diligence, triage, and actually assess the concern. And that can take time, but people should proceed as quickly as possible. If there are serious and credible concerns about the reliability of an article that require investigation, an expression of concern should be published as soon as possible. And we felt that, as with retractions, authors need to be informed, and it's helpful to give timelines by which you will proceed. So even if authors are unresponsive or don't agree, this can be stated in the expression of concern.
What if conclusive evidence cannot be obtained? So if you post an expression of concern and there's no more information ever available, we discussed at the beginning that in some cases, expressions of concern are meant to be interim notices that may be followed up with either a correction or a retraction. But if there is no more conclusive evidence, an expression of concern may exist as the final outcome for that document, where there just never is enough information to follow up with that correction or retraction.
So how should expressions of concern be resolved? Just echoing what Heather said there, that interim notice might become the final notice, or they might be resolved with a correction or a retraction when you know more information. We also considered the scenario where, what if it turns out that the expression of concern is unfounded? And in those scenarios, we felt that the journal should publish the outcome, likely some sort of correction or a note, as per the options available at the journal, explaining how the decision was reached and why the expression of concern was unfounded. We feel that they'd be quite rare scenarios because in a typical situation, due to due diligence and triage, you're usually pretty certain there's a serious concern before you post an expression of concern.
We also discussed, should expressions of concern be issued in cases of authorship disputes? And I'll note that this is an open discussion still, and we noted that within the document itself. As in the retraction guidelines, it says authorship is not typically an appropriate reason for retraction. We have stated in this document that authorship disputes are not typically a reason on their own for an expression of concern. The reason behind this was that in many instances, if the only concerns are about authorship, this does not affect the reader's ability to understand the work or the reliability of the content of the document itself. And also, it may not be possible for the editors to determine the credibility of an authorship concern until the completion of that, say, institutional investigation. We've also noted that there are cases where publishers and editors are using expressions of concern for authorship. For instance, if the authorship and, for instance, data origination concerns may bring into doubt the validity of the findings, such as in authorship for sale cases, or in other instances, editors and publishers have chosen to issue expressions of concern when it just doesn't seem like there's ever going to be a resolution to an authorship dispute. And there's no other way of marking that for the literature. This will be likely a still open discussion and may be updated in future versions of this document.
So what about the situations where an expression of concern is not appropriate? In the guidance, we wanted to acknowledge those situations. Sometimes it can be not at all immediately obvious what has happened, and publishing an expression of concern feels a bit premature and potentially punitive to authors. Or in a situation where you need to update an article, but it doesn't fall into the criteria of your typical post-publication amendment. So you want to explain a situation that doesn't call into question the reliability of the published research, but you don't want to use an expression of concern or a correction for that scenario. We are seeing and we recognise that publishers are experimenting with more neutral notes or notifications for these situations. And as with an expression of concern, there may be an interim notice that may ultimately be resolved with an expression of concern or a correction or a retraction. Or they might be the final outcome because they're explaining a certain scenario. We've discussed the use of notifications at United to Act within Working Group 2 as a way of speeding up post-publication correction in paper mill scenarios. And we've seen them used in Force 11 and COPE guidelines where concerns have been raised about published data. However, we want to acknowledge that while COPE, sees that notes should be used in these situations, they shouldn't be used in place of expressions of concern if you feel an expression of concern is appropriate. So in that scenario, you should use that expression of concern amendment.
I think this is the last question. Are there legal concerns editors should consider? We've noted, just as is stated in the retractions guidance document, that there may be threats of legal actions from authors whose papers are being considered for expression of concern, or potentially by those who are raising concerns and say there should be an expression of concern on a paper. As stated in the retraction guidance document, as long as you have information available about your processes and as long as you are following a reasonable approach, there's typically not reason to be concerned about potential legal action. However, we have noted that if you are concerned, it may be beneficial to consult legal counsel about the wording of an expression of concern.
So that was a quick recap on the sections in the document. And just to remind you now about those questions where it'll be helpful to discuss your experiences and feedback. What's been your experience when issuing an expression of concern? Are there particular challenges or pain points you've experienced? And what types of guidance will be useful going forward in discussing potential expressions of concern? So it'd be great for people to use the Q&A, and I see some questions are coming in.